what extent did the Iranians succeed in trying to do something that clearly is a response, but is not going so far as to make an Israeli counter-escalation inevitable or justified or too difficult for the US to stop it? That little narrow space is extremely narrow. If they fail at that, or if the Netanyahu government nevertheless uses it as an opportunity to escalate further, then I think we will be in a very dire situation in the region.
How close are we to a regional war between Israel and Iran? Is there a way to pull out from the brink, or is war inevitable? Welcome to the Big Picture podcast. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today we sit down with political analyst Trita Parsi. Parsi was the founder and former president of the Iranian American National Council and is currently the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute of Responsible Statecraft. Parsi, like many of us, has been watching the Middle East intensely since the assassination of Hamas's political chief Ismail Hanieyeh in the capital of Iran, Tehran. This happened just hours after Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, was inaugurated, leaving his new government humiliated on the domestic and international stage and vowing for revenge against Israel. It wasn't the first time Israel's government provoked Iran. The day before Hanieyeh's killing, Israel assassinated Hezbollah senior commander Fuad Shukr in an airstrike on Beirut. Back in April, it bombed Iran's consulate in Syria, forcing Iran to retaliate in a dramatic show of force, sending hundreds of drones into Israeli territory in a spectacle that was designed to save face without sparking a war. But this time could be very different, and Israel's biggest ally and primary weapons supplier, the United States, appears increasingly worried that it can no longer control a reckless and rogue Benjamin Netanyahu. But is that really true? The frightening reality is, even if no one really wants a war, we could be one fatal misstep away from a point of no return. Trita Parsi, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So last night, I was up till maybe like 2 a.m. Based off of these random rumors that came out. I think there was a report on Reuters that the Egyptian government had made a decision to close its airspace ahead of what was expected or rumored to be a response from Iran. That obviously didn't happen, but it has left me with a sense of deja vu because it feels like we're right back where we were back in April, where we are on the brink of what feels like a regional war. Everybody's waiting to see how Iran responds. Iran is trying to respond in a way that doesn't lead to a regional war. Do you think, we were here in April and now we're here again? Was it inevitable that this was going to happen?
I don't think it was inevitable, but I think it was quite clear that Netanyahu's incentive structure was such that he benefits from escalation. He benefits from prolonging the war. He benefits from making sure that there is no ceasefire because of his own political situation in Israel, in which a ceasefire would likely collapse his government. And once he's out of government, the corruption charges against him will be pursued. He's now essentially with immunity as prime minister, but once he's no longer prime minister, it will be pursued and he will likely end up in jail. I think what also happened, which I think points to the non-inevitability of this, is that Netanyahu came to Washington and he was in for a bit of a shock. Yes, he got far too many standing ovations in Congress. He shouldn't have gotten on. He shouldn't have gotten an invitation to begin with. But, roughly 100 plus Democrats who boycotted it. And then he met with Kamala Harris. And the message she sent him was essentially that the deference that the Biden administration has shown, or Biden himself has shown Netanyahu, is coming to an end. And it's not coming to an end if she wins. It's coming into an end rather soon because she's going to have a much bigger say in policy now when she's on top of the ticket than she did before. And I think he saw that. He saw the body language, the tone, and realized that for political and other reasons, she's going to take a much tougher stance. Now, we don't know on substance whether she would go as far as an arms embargo and many of the things that I think are rightfully demanded by a lot of people in the United States. But nevertheless, there was clearly a change of tone and rhetoric and indication. And if you're Netanyahu, you're not taking that for granted, you get worried. On top of that, he also saw that there's chaos in the United States because of the elections, which is normal, but there's disarray in the White House. Because this is a very unusual situation. Biden didn't leave voluntarily. We saw all of the massive efforts, including public humiliation, that was done in order for him to withdraw. So he didn't leave voluntarily or happily. She's taking over. It's unclear exactly who's calling the shots in terms of policy. There's some tensions between staffers on the two different teams. He saw disarray in the White House, went back to Israel and saw an opportunity. If he escalates now, he's going to achieve several different objectives: humiliate Iran, shut down the window for diplomacy between the US and Iran thanks to Pezeshkian's election, while also forcing Harris into a posture of continuing support for Israel by creating another crisis. Because whenever there's a crisis, particularly if it's Iran and Israel, the US's knee-jerk reaction is to just go and support Israel as much as possible. So instead of giving her the opportunity to have that influence on Biden and potentially the opportunity to come with her own initiatives, particularly if she becomes president, he's forcing her to react to him, react to the crisis that he's creating. Now, inevitable? No, because it wasn't inevitable that Biden would have been kicked out. None of these things were necessarily inevitable, but a congruence of various events led to a situation. And I think Netanyahu did something, well, I mean, he showed a tremendous amount of nimbleness and willingness to take surprising action. Perhaps one can say it's desperation given how badly he's performing in Gaza and politically at home. But nevertheless, he did something that surprised quite a few people.
And in terms of Netanyahu himself, I mean, he is a political gambler, if nothing else. And he's somebody that has always found a way to wiggle out of the tightest of situations. And that noose around his neck politically has continued to tighten, even throughout the last 10 months in the war. And he is looking for ways, as you have said, as other people have said, to prolong the war as much as possible. The assassinations, those twin assassinations that took place last week, have escalated the situation again, have pushed the region onto a brink of a possible regional war. And there is that question that continues to be asked about what Netanyahu wants to achieve. Is he really at a situation where he wants to risk a regional war? Or, as you said, is he reading the tea leaves in Washington and reading the tea leaves in the region and saying, I actually have a little bit more room to maneuver. I can keep pushing Iran. I can keep pushing Hezbollah. I can keep pushing the US, knowing that no one in their right mind is going to actually call my bluff.
I think what's important there is that neither of those two points are not mutually exclusive. In a sense that, yes, I think he saw maneuverability. He saw an opportunity to put everyone else on the defensive. But it's not that he's risking regional war. He desires it. And he seems to be okay if it leads to that. Remember, this is a person who, for the last 20 years, have pushed at every opportunity to get the United States to go to war with Iran. He pushed it in the last couple of months of Trump's presidency as well. And Trump seriously considered it, not because of geopolitical reasons, but because he felt that perhaps he can delay the transfer of power and essentially nullify the result of the 2020 elections. Earlier on, when Netanyahu had pushed Trump to do so, Trump had actually told him, if you want to go to war with Iran, why don't you go to war with Iran? Instead of, expressing the usual American talking point that we will back you regardless of what you do, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a person with a very impressive track record of pushing the United States to go to war in the region, particularly against Iran. So I don't think it is that he's risking it. He's seeing a win-win situation. Either I escalate and I put everyone else on defensive, I'm expanding my maneuverability, I'm killing the window for US-Iran diplomacy, I do all of those things. And on top of that, if it leads to a regional war, well, this is something I've been seeking for quite some time because I need a balance of power in the region that is much, much more favorable towards Israel, that gives Israel far more maneuverability. Go back to the old days in which Israel could bomb most countries in the region and no one could do anything about it. That's what I want. I can't achieve it using my own power. I can achieve it, however, if I can drag the United States into the war, and US military power can achieve that balance for me. So
I
it's a
think
win-win. It can go halfway, it can go full way.
a few months ago, we reached a point with the U.S. political establishment, especially the Biden and his administration, where it seemed like they had had enough of Netanyahu, and they were starting to pursue a path of essentially trying to pressure him to step down publicly. You had people like Senator Chuck Schumer, the speaker of the most powerful person inside the Democratic National Committee, essentially calling him out by name. And when he came to speak of the Congress, Chuck Schumer didn't shake his hand. A large number of Democrats didn't attend that meeting. There was a signal from the Democratic establishment that Netanyahu needs to step aside. Now it seems that Netanyahu has somehow survived that and has gone back to this position where both Harris and Trump, certainly, who's a lot more vocal than she is, have to figure out ways of not only dealing with him, but appeasing him ahead of the elections. Do you think he's managed to kind of survive this soft attempt at trying to get rid of him?
I think that the key word in what you said there is soft. And on the one hand, I'm not in favor of the United States trying to do regime change in any country. It almost always ends up badly. And even as much as I find Netanyahu a highly problematic person, I think we should also recognize that the United States does not have much control over who would come afterwards. And we've seen that politics in Israel have radicalized dramatically, and the next prime minister of Israel may actually be worse. That would be, not an atypical outcome for how the US's regime change policies have taken place. But I do think, however, in the case of Netanyahu, he is not shy about interfering in US politics and in US presidential politics. And as a result, for the US to push back is not necessarily wrong. However, the pushback that should have happened is not that, because that's not effective. It actually plays into Netanyahu's hands. The pushback that should have happened would be much earlier on, in which the United States would seize arms shipments to Israel when it was clear that Israel was not seeking a ceasefire and was essentially gaming for some form of an endless war. The Israeli general himself said in November of last year that if the Americans stops the arms shipments, we will have to end the war in 5 days. And part of the reason for that is because the Israelis are using ammunition and weapons at a record pace, using AI targeting their bombing way more than what we've seen in previous wars. And as a result, they're just consuming this at a pace that is really unprecedented in many different ways. And they wouldn't be able to continue at that pace or at any pace if the United States stopped the arms shipments. But we have seen systematically that Biden always stays short of actually using the leverage that could be effective. And then he goes and does other things that are much, much riskier. I mean, this whole bet was that Biden would get some sort of a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal and then hoping that push Netanyahu out of office. And then with this deal being on the table, it would give a huge boon to some of the more so-called moderate elements in Israel, none of them truly moderate, but nevertheless in that context, in the hope that the Israeli public would see the benefits of a normalization with Israel and as a result, turn away from the more radical elements there. It's wishful thinking. Theoretically, it makes sense, perhaps, but it's based on so many assumptions and so many things that can go wrong. It is not an effective way of pursuing policy. What is not speculative, what is not depending on 50 things going the right way, is just tell the Israelis, you're not going to get any more weapons if you continue this war. That would actually work. It's actually direct leverage. But anything like that, Biden has stayed away from.
And now we're at a situation where we are less than 3 months out from the election. Biden has very visibly taken a step back from speaking about this issue very publicly. We're seeing Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, being a lot more front-facing about this. At the same time, the Democrats are trying to win an election, and they are trying to not be seen to be dragged down by this issue that had almost, had been a big influence in derailing Biden's chances against Trump in the polls. But 3 months out from this election, with the Republicans on their tail and trying to use any way any reason to beat Harris, and certainly the Israeli relations, how closely the administration is to Israel and Israel's government is historically one of the key issues that arises at this point in an election. What avenues, what space is there for the Biden administration to actually take any drastic action? Is it way too late? Should this have happened way sooner, and now they're basically in a situation where their hands are tied from now until November?
So it absolutely should have happened way sooner. And if Biden was on top of the ticket, the calculation in the White House would have continued to be that even if they internally admitted that it was a mistake, the manner in which they connected themselves, locked themselves to Netanyahu's strategy, and as a result had to follow him regardless of what he did, even if they admitted that, their conclusion was, if they change course now, they will not gain back the people who they have lost, but they may lose the people that have stuck with them, the ones that are for some reason thinking that this is brilliant policy. So if Biden was on top of the ticket, that would be the calculation. He's not on top of the ticket. Harris is. And it's very clear she recognizes, even though I think the way she handled the rally yesterday was far less than optimal, to be kind to her. But she recognizes the politics of this. She recognizes that this will cost her tremendously. And keep one thing in mind. Biden has been on the forefront of American foreign policy for 1/5 of America's history. That's a long time.
That's a hell of a way to put it, yeah.
Right? And he has formed his view of what the politics around Israel is back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He's not updated himself with how the politics of this issue has changed dramatically. We are not in the 1990s, in which AIPAC was so powerful you could not even say its name. We're now in a situation in which members of Congress on the Republican and Democratic side, and I say Republicans even, are fundraising off of opposing AIPAC. This was unthinkable 10 years ago. You have a grassroots movement in the Democratic Party, which is the most energetic element of the Democratic base right now, that are dead set against the policies of Biden on this issue, who have come, and a generation of new American leaders, all of these students at Columbia and Harvard and MIT, this is the future elite of this country, who have come to view Israel as a result of what Israel has done, as an apartheid state, as a genocidal state that is also a threat to American democracy. I'm not making a judgment as to whether they're right or wrong. I'm describing how they're seeing it. And they vote. They're important. I think Harris sees this. Moreover, keep one thing else in mind. Harris has very strong support and proximity to the African American community, one of the most important constituencies for the Democrats. Amongst the African American community, this issue is extremely important, and they're very much on the side of expressing solidarity with the Palestinians and against the slaughter that is taking place. And this is for several different reasons. I'll just name two. The largest Muslim community in the United States is African Americans. If you take an average Muslim in the United States, he is not Arab. He's not Pakistani. He's African American. Secondly, the Black Lives Matter movement in the last 10 years have been an absolutely crucial development. And Black Lives Matter, long before October, became closely intertwined with the struggle of the Palestinians. So the perspectives in that community is dramatically different in whatever Catholic Irish community, whatever it is that Biden sees as his core community. And Harris is not indifferent to that. She understands it, she sees it, she recognizes it. Will she act on it, etc.? I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that she is exposed to a different reality of the politics of this issue in a way that Biden, for some reason, have managed to avoid getting exposed to. He's been living in the political realities of almost 30 years ago. And I remember I was here 30 years ago, 20 years ago. It was a dramatically different atmosphere. The idea that you would publicly speak out against AIPAC, let alone fundraise off of your opposition to AIPAC and things like that, it was unthinkable back then. Things have changed. Those changes, Harris cannot wish away. It is costly for her to go back to Biden's policy. Doesn't mean that she may not. I'm just pointing out that it's costly, whereas it wasn't costly 20, 30 years ago. And this is also true on the Republican side. On the Republican side, you have a very strong movement at the grassroots level that have really taken on this idea of America first. I'm not saying it's a sophisticated doctrine or anything like that, but there's some core ideas in it, and they're very strongly opposed to funding wars elsewhere. They're very much opposed to the way that the United States is funding the war in Ukraine. They certainly are opposed to sending troops to Ukraine. And now polls show also that a majority of Americans oppose sending troops to defend Israel. You cannot really adopt that view coherently and then make an exception for Israel. Because Israel is the country that is most likely to drag the United States into another war. If you make an exception for Israel, you've essentially nullified the idea of America first. It has become meaningless if you make an exception for Israel. This wasn't necessarily the case 4 years ago or 6 years ago, but we've seen a movement amongst that constituency in which they have tried to make some of those ideas more coherent. And part of making it more coherent is to be less tolerant of exceptions to it. And we see it. We see it. That's the intellectual evolution, I think, of someone like Tucker Carlson. 10 years ago, he would probably have made that exception for Israel. He would have rallied against Ukraine money, but either ignored Israel or even tried to defend it. But that's no longer the case. He's actually out there in a very, very vocal way against these things. So I think this issue is changing politically on the Republican and the Democratic side. As a result, neither one of them actually are eager to talk too much about this. So you will probably not see that much focus on this issue in this campaign per the preference of both sides, because they can take swipes at each other, but it's a little unclear exactly how it will play with their own base, because there are conflicting views within the Democrats and within the Republicans on this issue. I think we saw that in the debate, if we can call it a debate between Trump and Biden, in which both of them were trying to pivot away from Israel-Palestine. Biden would love to talk about Ukraine, and guess what? So would Trump. That's where the division is much clearer, and both of them are better off either criticizing the Ukraine support or praising it as a sign of American leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, I think Trump, and when he has spoken about Israel and when he has spoken about Gaza, he's been extremely vague. And his most biting criticism of Biden is that Biden has messied the situation and not found a coherent solution to it sooner.
You will see some of that, I'm sure, but so far you haven't seen him really make it a central talking point that, oh, Biden has betrayed Israel and Biden should have done X, Y, and Z and supported Israel more. You will hear some of it. It's not the central talking point. The central talking point, look at what a mess he's created. If it was me, these wars would not have happened at all. I'm the peacemaker. I'm the one who can fix these things. Instead of necessarily saying, I would have sent troops here, I would have bombed here, and things of that nature, because he knows that doesn't play well with his base.
And speaking about the changing political landscapes, I want to talk to you about Iranian-American relations and how they have changed and transformed over the years. There was a time not so long ago where it seemed that the most important issue for Republicans was confronting Iran, and that some of the most vocal people in the Republican Party were the ones that were advocating for an all-out war against Iran. They weren't in power then, and they didn't have the tools to actually do it. And you can question whether or not they were actually genuine and honest about what they were saying. But now we're at a point where that feels like it's no longer of interest, or it feels like a distraction at best and a real threat at worst to try and derail what the U.S. has been trying to do in the Middle East, which is essentially leave as quietly as possible. How do you see how that relationship with Iran has changed? And obviously you mentioned that Israel has been an integral part of trying to keep that from moving anywhere constructive.
So let me first talk about the American side of it. And what you just mentioned there about the Republicans is absolutely true. And it's completely compatible with what I said earlier on. The grassroots are changing. These type of traditional Republicans that are tough on foreign policy and are making threats of bombing here and there. And these, the Lindsey Grahams, they don't have much grassroots support. They're increasingly a minority within the party and will be so in the future because the younger generation of Republicans are very, very different. The younger cohort of Republicans close to Trump, I mean, they seem to see as their number one enemy, not the Democrats, but the neocons. It's really fascinating to see how strongly those sentiments are held. As a result, what used to be a very useful political football for the Republicans, constantly speak tough on Iran, speak in a pro-war way, knowing very well that, most likely there wouldn't be a war, so it was cost-free for them to do so. It's no longer cost-free. It's also not particularly beneficial because that type of aggressive warmongering, even if it's just for show, it's just not as appreciated in the Republican ranks as it was before. I'm not saying it's completely gone, but it's just not what it was before. That doesn't mean that there is particular openness to diplomacy or anything like that. I mean, the core element of leaving is actually to leave. It's not about making friends and then leave. It's not about any of those different things. It's that all kinds of engagements in the Middle East have ended up, from this perspective, not particularly beneficial to the United States. It's been a lose-lose situation. So taking this side or that side is not the issue. It's about making sure that you're not entangled in those different conflicts. So that may end up creating a situation in which the Republicans are not going to be as gung-ho in pushing for military strikes or opposing even diplomacy, as long as it doesn't become politicized again. And we'll see what will happen if Trump comes back. I would suspect that there is a likelihood, not perhaps a majority likelihood, but a likelihood that Trump will look around. He has a very strong desire to be a peacemaker, a deal maker. That's for some reason a vision he has of himself. And he would look around and say, okay, where can I make those deals? Ukraine, potentially, but also potentially with Iran, particularly now with Pezeshkian coming in and saying that he wants to talk to the US. When you look at what he did during his term, I think it was an absolute disaster that he pulled out of the Iran deal. I do think, however, in his bizarre way, he actually wanted to make a deal. He just wanted to make sure it was a better deal or that he could claim that it was a better deal. But his ultimate aim was a deal, not war. He just had the lack of wisdom of surrounding himself with neocons like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, who sold to him a strategy that they essentially told him, this is the strategy that will get you a deal. You just have to crush the Iranian economy, make them beg on their knees for a deal, and that's when you make a better deal. And that may be how you buy a new building in Manhattan. I don't know. But that's not how you do diplomacy in the Middle East. Because what the Iranians did, of course, is that they resisted and they started to expand their nuclear program to have counter leverage against the United States. And you could see it in the tone of some of the last comments Trump gave on this, that he was quite disappointed that he never got to that point. Well, if he had not listened to neocons, he wouldn't have adopted that strategy in the first place, I think. He would probably have done similar to what he did with North Korea, a lot of empty talk first and threats and tweets about all the things he would do. And then as soon as he got an opportunity to go there and shake his hand, he rushed. I mean, he absolutely rushed. And just another detail of how important deal making is for him and how immune he is to what is politically acceptable in Washington. After the Doha Agreement, in which the Qataris helped mediate a deal with the Taliban that would allow the United States to lead, Trump wanted to invite the Taliban leadership to Camp David for a photo op. It was the Taliban that denied the invitation. They were the ones who said no. Whereas, any other president in the United States would not even have thought the thought of having a photo shoot, photo opportunity with the Taliban leadership. But that's how unconventional he is, but also the obsession he has with coming across as a deal maker and a peacemaker. With what happened in Iran now with Pezeshkian's elections is a very interesting development. The Iranians had gone down a path of essentially giving up the idea that you could make a deal with the United States that would see sustained sanctions relief. A reading of US politics that essentially says the US is not capable of providing prolonged sanctions relief. Even if one president does so, the other one will uproot it. So it's not going to work. Instead, Iran should do sanctions neutralization, which means you intensify your direct trade with all of your Arab neighbors and other neighbors, and you bypass the dollar, you trade in your local currencies, you integrate more with the region, and that way, the United States cannot really impose its financial sanctions because if you're not trading in the dollar, it will bypass the measures that the United States have put in place. That's not a strategy that came out of the last conservative government, although they put almost all of their eggs in that strategy. With Pezeshkian coming in, he is not deviating from it in the sense of giving up on it. On the contrary, he made clear that the top priority still remains improved relations with Iran's neighbors, particularly the Arab neighbors. And one hint of that, incidentally, is that under these circumstances, where there is such a slaughter in Gaza, had this taken place 25 years ago, or even just 15, 20 years ago, the Iranian government would have made a huge deal out of that in order to increase the distance between the Arab streets and the Arab regimes. And it would have used that against the Arab regimes. And there's no better opportunity for them to do so, given what is happening in Gaza right now. Yet they're not. They're not doing so. Not against Saudi Arabia, not against any country at this point, because the priority is actually to improve the relations. Pezeshkian seems to come in with an idea of not abandoning that, but complementing and saying ultimately, that will not be sufficient. Sanctions relief from the United States is ultimately necessary in order for Iran's economy to be able to function properly, because there will not be any Arab investments, even though Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Qatar, all of these countries have tremendous amount of money and could heavily invest in Iran. They're not going to do so unless there is sanctions relief from the United States. They're too dependent on the United States. They have too many other interests to pick such a fight with the US to actually violate US sanctions. And even with China, that doesn't have the same concerns with the US, they're also not investing in Iran because of US sanctions. So you have to complement that by actually lifting the US sanctions as well. And what I think was interesting with what he was saying during the campaign, he didn't make a differentiation as to whether it would be a Trump government or a Biden or Harris government. He just said the Iranians need to talk to the US and renew diplomacy, which is quite significant, mindful of the fact that Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani. In some ways, that was almost papered over.
And that is an interesting point, because it seems that, we'll come back to this direct confrontation with Israel, but their relationship with the U.S. has also been one that has been, from the Iranian perspective, quite humiliating over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of blows. Qasem Soleimani is probably the most significant, but also when nationwide protests over the Mahsa Amini killing were taking place, that the U.S. was not hiding the fact of what side they were on there and how they felt about the Iranian regime, and how that regime change in Iran was still, at least publicly, something that the U.S. was happy to back. And then there is Israel and what happened in April and what's been happening since and what happened last week. And it seems that from the Iranian perspective, we saw this in the United Nations when the ambassador read a statement that said that the assassination of Ismail Hanieyeh wouldn't have happened without the express support and acknowledgement of the United States. How is Iran and successive Iranian regimes, but this latest one with Masoud Peshkashian, how is he able to sell that to the Iranian public when what they can see is a United States that is constantly humiliating them publicly over and over again?
I think with the larger public, it's not going to be terribly difficult to sell it because the larger public feels humiliated by the United States, but most of their anger is at the humiliation they feel from the Iranian regime itself. And breaking out of that isolation, getting the economy back on its feet, not having to deal with sanctions is going to be something that will be strongly welcomed. They have now, in the last couple of years, there's been some shifts in Iran. There was a lot of support for the idea of reform. Reform could improve their lives, and eventually reform would lead to the collapse of the regime, but it would be controlled, it would be gradual, it would not be abrupt and uncontrollable as a revolution. But reform did not yield the results that they were hoping for. I personally think that had Trump not pulled out of the JCPOA and the JCPOA had been in place for a couple of more years, I think you would have actually seen quite a lot of interesting changes in Iran. But JCPOA was never really given a chance to work because it took only a year and a half before Trump came. And as soon as he came in, even though it took a year for him to pull out, there was such uncertainty as to whether he would stay or pull out that you could see the impact on the business climate in the sense that no one was going to go into the Iranian economy from the outside, not knowing whether Trump would stay or leave. So that uncertainty in and of itself is actually a sanction. It has the same impact as an economic sanction. So essentially, it's the minute Trump came in, economic sanctions were reimposed de facto. Then at least the younger generation shifted towards no, forget about regime reform. They just want regime change. And we saw that very clearly in the Masa Amini protest. There wasn't any call for changes within the system, it was an overhaul of the system. And that failed. Now, I think they did succeed in many different things. I mean, the issue of the hijab is a very different conversation in Iran than it was before. The regime has by and large largely backed off of that. Not entirely, but by and large. And that is a huge victory. But in the sense of overthrowing the regime was not even close to being able to achieve that. So it seems like there is a bit of a disillusionment in the sense that they've given up on reform, they've given up on revolution, and there is no alternative theory of change that has emerged that is getting people to come to it. And I think we saw that with a very low participation rate in the elections this past month. The first round was even lower than it was back in 2021. Which frankly surprised me. It did go up in the second round. It was partly because the alternative was so stark with Jalili almost being a Trump type of a factor there in the election, but it was still less than 50%. So you have a situation in which at this point, anything that improves the economy is the most important thing. And sanctions relief and diplomacy with the US that reduces the risk of war and give some hope of sanctions relief, I think will be supported by the population. Let me say one thing, though, about what you said about the Biden administration's approach to Iran. I think the Biden administration came in on day one and adopted essentially a Hillary Clinton type of a approach to Iran, in which the most important thing, regardless of what happens, is to show your disdain for Iran. This is important for that part of the Democratic Party that has this view of itself as America being in some sort of a perfect and impossible to make mistakes, moral superior entity in the world. And you manifest that by, showing disdain for the governments and regimes that are doing bad things objectively. Now, of course, they don't do that against other governments, such as in Saudi Arabia, that does it. But nevertheless, let's say this.
Well, they tried initially. I think Biden tried to, and then they had to backtrack pretty dramatically.
Yeah, that's true. But nevertheless, even with that, the hypocrisy is obviously stunning and obvious. But I would not necessarily align myself with the analysis that says that the Biden administration actually tried to help the protesters that much. I think what they were doing was doing everything they could to look as if they were helping the protesters. But in reality, they were not doing much at all because they understood the complete risks of actually getting really deeply involved in regime change. And they didn't want that. They just wanted to look superior morally. That's more important than actually having an effective policy. And I give you an example. In some ways, I think it was quite creative. At the Oscars, they created an alternative, completely new category, song with the greatest social impact. The only nominee was the Iranian song Baraye by this, prior to that, relatively unknown but extremely talented Iranian musician who had written a fantastic song with a brilliant text, lyrics, really expressing the pain of his generation because of the repression of the Iranian regime. And they had Jill Biden give the prize to him, although of course he was in Iran. I mean, this was such brilliant political theater. It was all about looking as if they're doing something, whereas in reality, they really weren't. Realizing, of course, how difficult it would be and how risky it would be if they actually did. But it was more important for them to come across as if they were taking the right side or the moral side, whatever they want to express it, and actually doing it.
Let's talk about Pezeshkian. He's only just touched his feet down and in this new position, and now he has to deal with this massive escalation from Israel's government, from Netanyahu. You have spoken about how in the past Iran has tried to avoid as much as possible getting into a direct confrontation. The last thing they want is an escalation. The last thing anyone wants, maybe apart from Netanyahu, is an escalation. And yet they're here having failed essentially to create the deterrent that they hoped to create in April. The huge show of force that was essentially, directly or indirectly coordinated with the U.S. to try and restore Iran's positioning publicly, internationally, and domestically. And now they're here again, and now everyone's waiting to see what they're going to do. What options does he have, and what mood is there, if any, inside Iran for a real confrontation?
So I don't think there is any desire whatsoever within the regime or within the public at large for an actual war with Israel. And even what they have been messaging the Iranian public through TV and all of their different efforts to build up support, it's all about deterrence and making sure that Israel is pushed back and cannot do this again. I've seen no voices or constituency actually pushing for an all-out war. That's not where they're coming from. But as you pointed out quite correctly, the show of force in April, if it created a degree of deterrence, it lasted 4 months, which is far, far, far short of what it needed to do. And this has then put the Iranians in a bit of a bind, bit of a escalatory trap for them. Because prior to this, they had the policy of strategic patience. They were taking a lot of hits, in Syria in particular. And they were absorbing those hits because they knew the time was on their side, or they calculated the time was on their side. And if there was going to be a confrontation of some kind, it was better to have it in the future when Iran is in a better position than to do it now. Recognizing this, the Israelis then kept on pushing and pushing and pushing. Because if the Iranians are going to absorb, then you might as well do as much as you can before the Iranian patience runs out. And perhaps they didn't calculate that the strike against the embassy, the consulate section of the embassy, would cause an end to that patience, but it did. But once they responded to that, they have now put themselves in a position in which they're under far more pressure now to respond to the killing of Hanieyeh than they would have been had they never responded to the April attack. Because now they've abandoned strategic patience, they can't go back to it. It's very, very difficult for them. Moreover, all of the strong messaging that they sent very early on, Khamenei himself saying that there's going to be a response, is also going to make it very difficult for them to walk this back. Now, there is some diplomatic activity right now to see what could be done to get the Iranians to declare victory by achieving something without using the military. And that, of course, goes for Hezbollah as well. And, at the center of it is a ceasefire in Gaza. But it can't just be a ceasefire in Gaza. It has to also be a commitment from Israel that there will be a ceasefire on the Lebanese border as well. 83% of all of the missiles that have been exchanged over that border has been sent from Israel. It's not been sent from Hezbollah. They only account for about 17% of it, which is a stark number, mindful of the fact that the way the Western media has presented it makes it sound as if it's more or less an even fight. It's not even close. The Israelis have been far more aggressive. So it would have to be combined with that, minimum. But I don't even think that is enough. I think we may have moved beyond the point in which a ceasefire in Gaza could have calmed down or would have calmed down the other conflicts. At least there will be one more episode of something, even with the ceasefire. Unless it is also combined with something else. And I think it's not clear what that would be. I'm sure the diplomats are trying to figure out what is the price tag that they would put forward in order to actually back down. Would it be a US withdrawal from Syria or Iraq, a timetable for something like that, or other types of things that would enable the Iranians and Hezbollah to say, we achieved something, and as a result, there won't be a military response. The idea that the Iranians will not respond solely because the US is moving military troops to the region or signaling Iran what it will do to them militarily, I find unconvincing. For them to be able to agree, they have to point to a win rather than saying, okay, not only did we take a hit, but the Americans are telling us they will hit us even more, so we're going to back down. That would be a devastating blow to their prestige. And I think Iran's prestige in some ways have already been hurt and damaged over the course of the last couple of months because they've taken a lot of hits, but also they have been pressing some of the other members of the Axis to stand down. The Iraqi militias were not happy when they got that pressure from Iran. The Houthis have publicly complained about that pressure and also, incidentally, not listened to the Iranians because they've continued to do what they do. So I think the Iranians, their standing within this has already been damaged somewhat and will be damaged much more if there isn't some response or if there isn't some win that they can point to.
At this point, to your point about all of the diplomatic back-channeling that is happening now between the US and Iran, they are trying to talk them down. They've been in this position again a couple of months ago, and here we are. There are, as you mentioned, there are a couple of things that are potentially on the table, but what do you think is enough for Iran to publicly look like it isn't backing down out of a weakness, but it's backing down out of a strategic wisdom?
I think, again, minimum ceasefire in Gaza and combined with the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, absolute minimum. I don't think it's enough. I think there has to be something more. And it's not entirely clear to me what that would be. Something symbolic from the US may not be sufficient, but a timetable for a withdrawal from Iraq or a withdrawal from Syria might be. I have no idea whether the US would agree to that. There's plenty of people in Washington that would like to leave Iraq and Syria, but it's a different thing to leave Iraq and Syria militarily. It's a different thing to do so under duress. Now, of course, this would be more of a deal. This is both sides backing down. But for something like that to work out and for something like that to be convincing, it requires that the United States is willing to use its leverage against Israel to force it into a ceasefire. So even on that original point, it's not clear to me that there is any trust and confidence on the Iranian side that the US can deliver. The US has not delivered for the last 10 months. I think the US can deliver, but does it want to deliver? Is it willing to spend that political capital? Is it willing to pay the political cost in Washington for pressing Israel in that way? Certainly, the Biden administration has shown no interest in doing so. Remember, in April, The Iranians offered not to respond if there was a ceasefire and if there was a condemnation by the UN Security Council. The US, together with the UK, blocked a presidential statement at the council condemning it. And I don't think they took the issue of a ceasefire seriously at all. And who knows, perhaps the Iranians were not serious about that. Perhaps was a public ploy, but it was never really even explored to figure out whether there actually was seriousness behind it.
And this is the confusing aspect of the relationship between the Biden administration and Netanyahu's administration, this apparent inability for America to be able to rein in its closest ally, its primary weapons buyer, this state that has increasingly become a rogue actor in the region. And you're having the leaks that have coming out between the phone calls between Biden and Netanyahu, suggesting that Biden is increasingly frustrated by Netanyahu. He feels betrayed by him. He feels like he's being lied to. But as you mentioned, there in so many ways, the U.S. still holds all of the leverage that Israel cannot continue for a day or for 5 days without that continued supply of weapons. And Joe Biden is somebody that has in the past spoken very frankly about the benefits of that relationship between Israel and the U.S. and how Israel in many ways is somewhat of a proxy power for the U.S. in the Middle East, in the region. There was a quote by him from a couple of decades ago that says, how many warships, how many fleets of troops will we need to have stationed in the Middle East constantly if it wasn't for our ally Israel? And so I'm wondering, and aside from the political theater that's taking place in the headlines, is the United States benefiting from this indirect show of dominance of force that it is able to exert in a region that it wants to pull out of without needing to have a presence there through its partner Israel? I mean, this has been a war for the last 10 months played out almost entirely by U.S. weaponry, by U.S. arms supplies, by U.S. technology. This is an indirect U.S. conflict that it is embroiled in, even if it pretends to have a distance from. Do you think the U.S. in a way is benefiting from continuing to allow Israel to act in the way that it is?
I think it's been absolutely disastrous for the United States. It, of course, very much depends on how you define U.S. interests. The way most mainstream think tanks in Washington define U.S. interests, if they even talk about it in a report on the Middle East, is a very long list of things, 10, 12 points. And the last point usually is standing by our allies, which is like a catch-all variable. Everything you have already not listed is then listed in that last one, because it essentially means the interests of our allies are also our interest. Well, then suddenly everything in the region is your interest. Under those circumstances, you shouldn't be surprised that the US is always at war. If you define it that broadly, the bar for getting involved militarily is extremely low. If you define US interest in a much more narrow way, as the Quincy Institute does and restrainers do, we look at it and we say, there was a period of time in which the region was very important to the United States because of its energy resources. The United States is now energy independent. It's actually exporting energy. The strategic significance of the Middle East is not today what it was 50 years ago. As a result, having that level of military presence does not make any sense. It doesn't make any sense in the first place being that involved in the politics of the region and always getting embroiled in every conflict that exists. And again, being on the sides of our allies means that whenever there's a conflict, the US is in that conflict. The US is not a peacemaker. It is not a mediator. It is a part of the conflict. Contrast that to the Chinese. They're not part of any conflict. And they're mediating several ones, some successfully, some not. And even if they fail with this latest thing with the Palestinian factions, the signal they have sent is that they're trying. They're trying to move things in the right direction. They may fail, but they're trying. Few can point to the US and say, yes, for the last couple of years, the US has been trying to move things in the right direction. No, the US is a party to almost every conflict in the region because of this idea that we're on the side of our allies. Their interest is our interest. If you define it much more narrowly, you recognize that you actually don't have to dominate this region, you may still need to make sure that no one else can dominate it. But if you define it that way, you still don't need to have a single military base. We published a report a couple of years ago by Eugene Gould, who is a former Pentagon official under the Obama administration, and asked if our interest is only to make sure, in terms of the military side of it, that no one else can dominate the region and control its resources, that there cannot be another hegemon in the region, what's the military posture the United States needs? And a careful analysis showed that there's no country in the region that has the capacity of projecting force in such a way to be a hegemon. There's going to be more powerful, less powerful countries, but none of them can actually do so. And it's a combination of military capabilities and the geography and the topography of the Middle East. As a result, not a single military base, permanent base, is needed in the Middle East for the United States to prevent any regional country from establishing hegemony. And if an extra regional country, China or Russia, would ever have the dumbest idea of the world, which is that now it's their turn to be the hegemon of the region, the US could still prevent that by having over-the-horizon forces, meaning that forces are further away but would intervene quickly if that scenario were to emerge. But we have no sign whatsoever that the Chinese have reached that level of stupidity of thinking that it's a good thing for them to be a hegemon in the Middle East. And the Russians can't even reach Kyiv, so how are they going to be the dominant hegemonic power in the Middle East? So this is completely unnecessary, our posture there. And it's to a very large extent, but not entirely, driven by the idea of supporting Israel. I mean, the presence in Syria and Iraq to a very large extent is to counter Iran's influence vis-a-vis Israel for a variety of reasons. And it doesn't serve our interests. It hasn't helped us in the slightest way. The United States now, under the last 10 months, is more isolated at the UN on the issue of Gaza than Russia was on Ukraine. We have vetoed, what is it now, 3 or 4 resolutions just calling for a ceasefire, while we at the same time saying, on all the reports in the media here claims that, Biden continues to fight for a ceasefire. There's a degree of dishonesty or just plain stupidity in framing it that way when we're the ones who've been constantly vetoing those efforts. And the one resolution we allowed to pass, even after trying very strongly to water it down, afterwards, once it passed, we turned around and said it's not binding, which is completely ridiculous. There's no legal basis for claiming that a UN Security Council resolution is not binding under Chapter 6 or 7. This has tremendously hurt America's stand. Note that the Biden administration is not talking about the rules-based order any longer. This was the term that they used over and over again after Ukraine, even before Ukraine, but after Ukraine, it was like in every second sentence. They've more or less completely stopped using it. They only use it occasionally on Ukraine now. And on Gaza, they haven't mentioned it a single time. And that was a very big deal for the United States. It sacrificed it to support Israel. To achieve what? What is the big US interest in seeing 40, 50,000 Palestinians die in Gaza that justifies all of these different sacrifices of clearer, much more important US interests than that? It's really mind-boggling. And I think history is going to be extremely unkind to the Biden administration's handling of this when this history is written 20, 30 years from now.
And you've seen countries in the region over the last couple of years begin to look elsewhere for a sense of diplomatic leadership. You mentioned China. China not only has been trying to build bridges between the Palestinian factions, really for the first time on its own terms, but it also managed to, superficially or otherwise, create this historic rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia that can't be easy for the U.S. to watch, because that is traditionally the role that the U.S. sort of imposed on the region, and now it's in a position where it is losing traction and losing the dominance that its voice, not necessarily militarily, but just in terms of diplomacy, had extended over the region. Do you think that it's in a state of retreat, essentially?
This is really unnecessary in my view, because I think the US could have withdrawn militarily and advanced diplomatically, meaning that the US doesn't have to be the dominant military force. It certainly shouldn't be involved in every conflict, it actually opens up space for it to play a bigger diplomatic role and go back to a posture that it held before, in which it actually did mediate conflicts. I'm not saying it did a fantastic job, and I'm not saying that every conflict it could mediate in, but it could mediate in some. So instead of retreating diplomatically as we are, without retreating militarily, because we still have about 50,000 troops, this is the worst of all outcomes. This is a disaster. And the even more mind-boggling thing is that those who are calling for a military withdrawal are being accused in Washington of being isolationists. Whereas it's actually the policy of these who seek military domination that has led to the United States having almost no diplomatic or talking ability with most actors in the Middle East, is not engaging with them, is sanctioning half the population of the Middle East, if not more, 3/4 of the world's population. And that apparently is engagement. That's how we engage with the world. And those who say that that's the wrong approach, let's talk more, let's trade more, but let's bomb less, that's isolationism. Tells you how much things are upside down in Washington.
Finally, Dr. Parsi, we are expecting a response from Iran. It could be any minute. It could be days away. When that does inevitably happen, what are the things that you look out for as an analyst to read what this means, who comes out on top, who benefits? What are the signs that you look out for?
I don't see any benefits in all of this. We should have evaded this situation. We're at a point in which it's all different degrees of who loses more. Particularly if this leads to a larger confrontation in the region, a lot of losers are going to emerge from that. Particularly the Palestinians are going to lose a tremendous amount. But what I do see, if it happens, I do believe it will happen in some shape or form, is to see the extent of it and see to what extent did the Iranians succeed in trying to do something that clearly is a response, goes beyond what they did in April, but is not going so far as to make an Israeli counter-escalation inevitable or justified or too difficult for the US to stop it. And I would also see to what extent are they succeeding in carefully making sure that they don't do anything that would pull the US into that fight. So that little narrow space is extremely narrow, very difficult for them to achieve. It's probably part of the reason why this is taking some time for them. If they fail at that, or if the Netanyahu government nevertheless uses it as an opportunity to escalate further, then I think we will be in a very dire situation in the region. There are those on both sides that believe some sort of a military confrontation is needed in order to establish a new balance. I think we should be at a point in human evolution in which we could seek a new balance without first having that military confrontation.
It's a poignant point to end on. Trita Parsi, thank you very much. It was a fascinating conversation, and we'll wait and see what the region has in store.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to our guest today, Trita Parsi. We want to know what you have to say about the ongoing and extremely volatile situation in the Middle East. So please leave your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what guest you would like us to have on the program next. As always, you can hear all of our episodes, including this one, wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, salam.